Hello, everyone. Welcome to an all new episode of the Indic Explorer Show. And I have a very glamorous celebrity intellectual guest here today, straight. I don't know from where, whether it's Australia, the United States, or Latins, but
The pages of history, that's where I'm coming from.
pages of comparative sociology.
Uh,
Yes, as you can see, Mr. Salvatore Babones for the second time. Namaste.
Maldev.
Coming on the heels of your second trip to India, you went to the Earth Festival. You also went to Mangalore, right? How was your itinerary like? And how, like, I think you were not doing well health wise, right? So, how was it like this trip?
Well, you forgot the most important part, my dinner on the Rajdhani Express, which
Oh,
was
yeah, I saw the
what
pictures.
incredibly what went so viral from my trip to India. It's funny, my first trip to India, the important thing was my serious academic weighty comments on Indian intellectuals and how the rankings are. My second visit to India, how'd you like the dinner? So I guess that's all things change, but I had a great time, and everyone was fantastically hospitable. And the best part for me is getting to meet people. I attended both the Mangalore Literature Festival, but then I was mainly there for the Art Festival. So I was at the Art Festival for 3 entire days. I met, I don't want to exaggerate and say hundreds, but at least scores of people, 70, 80, 90 people at the Art Festival, and had a continuous durbar, maybe is the word for it, or maybe what do you call it when when the Buddha sits under a tree and just is surrounded by
The
students.
sermon, the
Uh,
sermon.
it was wonderful being able to talk to so many people. I mean, anyone who saw the YouTube clips only saw a tiny fraction of what actually went on. I spent the entire 3 days of the Art Festival just talking to people, usually talking to 6 to 10 people at a time. At one point, about 20 people gathered around, and we all had a discussion, and they shared experiences with me. I shared thoughts with them. And for me as a sociologist, it was really invaluable. And for me as a human being, it was just a great pleasure.
Great. Because you participated in this Lit Fest, what do you think was in just generally your takeaway in terms of the quality of speakers, the topics that were discussed, and also generally because you had this whole discussion, a panel discussion in Earth as well, where you were talking about how the non-left has started writing, right, which was not as much voluminous as before. What were your takeaways from that event?
Well, look, obviously the quality of the speakers was very high. They had the best of India to pick from. The Art Festival was clearly a bit one-sided, and that's a bit of a disappointment. The shouting over dissenting views is something I never like to see, and there was some of that. And I think only because the political views of the people invited tilted so much towards one side. That said, it's if you went to a different literary festival, you'd have an entirely different tilt, and you might not have any conservative or religious representation at all. So I understand that that's par for the course. For me as an academic, of course, what I'd like to see is much more information and much less debate. But the festival as a whole had very high quality guests. For me, it was great to meet them off stage. So I had, again, lots of great conversations over lunch in the VIP tent. I hate to say it, but that was where my free lunch was in the VIP tent. So I got to have lunch with a lot of outstanding figures, and it was really interesting. I bought a few books, and I was given a few books that I'd already bought, which was kind of funny. But I had a great time. And I encourage everyone next year to, if you didn't get to the festival this year, go next year. It's a free entry festival, and well worth the money, so to speak. Certainly worth your time.
Absolutely, yeah. So, coming straight to the topic now, where do you think are the roots of, because you've spoken about this, the West, the hatred in the West towards India? Obviously, you have a more nuanced approach on this subject, but what are you've spoken from the point of view of Indians who are the ones who go there and they are the ones who represent India in Western outlets. But From a Western point of view, where do you think the roots lie?
First of all, there's not a hatred in the West towards India. We were joking about where I am. I'm actually in Sydney, Australia. I teach at the University of Sydney. And Prime Minister Anthony Albanese from Australia just visited India. All of this was breathlessly reported in the Australian media as how incredible it was that he was experiencing India and doing this and doing that and signing deals. I don't think there was a single line of criticism in the mainstream Australian media. There's some on the fringes, but the mainstream media was entirely supportive of stronger relations between India and Australia. We've seen the same in the U.S. with even Joe Biden, despite the fact that many members of his party are ideologically thoroughly opposed to Narendra Modi and the BJP. Nonetheless, at the presidential level and at the corporate level, there's incredible support for India. And of course, Rishi Sunak in the United Kingdom is a big India booster. There's no doubt about that. So there's not this broad anti-Western feeling or anti-India feeling in the West. It's a very narrow anti-India feeling, and it's very narrowly constituted among a small group of highly placed intellectuals who I think are motivated by a visceral anti-Hindu bigotry is really my only explanation for just how passionately opposed they are to political Hinduism. And then there's opposition in the West coming from Indians or members of the Indian diaspora or next generation Indians, but people who one way or another have a family origin in South Asia. So if you see that the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, the New York Times, CNN, The Economist, all carry thoroughly anti-Indian articles on a routine basis, just look at the authors. Or in the case of The Economist, which has corporate authorship, you look at the staff members. 80% of the time, those articles are actually being written by people of South Asian origin. Now, that doesn't mean they're wrong. It does mean that they are maybe more personally involved in these stories than they would like to admit. And that's a real problem we have in the West. I mean, especially in the American West, we have open societies where we take it on a pro forma basis that we don't look at your national origin when evaluating your fitness for a job. But the simple fact is that India coverage in the West used to be conducted by people who were simply Americans or British people of no particular connection to India. Now India coverage is overwhelmingly coming from people of South Asian origin. In a way, that's a victory for the diaspora. People have succeeded. They've moved up the ranks in these organizations. But in a way, it also tends to introduce biases based on people's personal politics that otherwise wouldn't have been there. And that's just a fact of life.
I want to go a little deeper in this because you mentioned an interesting point that it is either people from the diaspora or basically Indians in India who are getting platformed in these outlets, right? And your point is that they are the cause of all of this. But my question here is there's a screening that is happening. And I know last time we spoke about the New York Times hiring policy and all of that. But in general, okay, would you, let's say, if there is a discussion on Indian history, for example, would they give an opportunity for either Sai Deepak or Vikram Sampath or anyone on that side, the platform? See, the writers, the executors of that idea could be Indians. But when you screen people, and that screening is happening from Westerners, would they give a chance to a person who has another point of view? And hence, in my argument, because of this, is that there is that feeling, but they want Indians to voice it.
Look, you seem to see it as a demand for a reasonable airtime for contrasting views, and you see it as a debate. But that's not necessarily how it's seen within these organizations. So let's say we put out an advertisement. It's not going to be a formal ad, but let's say we're searching for a columnist to cover India. Now, of the 20 people who immediately put up their hands, I want to be the columnist covering India, 16, 18 are going to be of Indian extraction or of Pakistani or Bangladeshi extraction. Now, we as Westerners and Western organizations in general have an absolute commitment of non-discrimination It's actually a legal commitment in most countries not to discriminate on the basis of national origin, which means the Italian American who puts up his hand saying, I want to cover India, and the Bengali American who puts up her hand saying, I want to cover India, we're both treated the same. And there's no sense that, well, if the Bengali American puts up her hand, yeah, we have to get someone who's going to balance her in our news coverage. That is, she's simply being appointed as the nonpartisan, even-handed person whom we trust to present issues analytically without bias. Now, we all know as human beings, Russians who cover Russia either are pro-Putin or anti-Putin, and that's going to affect their coverage. Chinese people of Chinese origin who cover China are either going to be regime-linked or regime critics, and that's going to color their coverage. We all know this, but we can't officially recognize this in our procedures. Right? So the people whose India articles you might be upset about are not being appointed by the New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal to represent a particular side of Indian politics. They're being appointed to be a neutral observer on India. The fact that they don't actually perform that role, of course, is a practical problem that exists. But the reason they're being brought in is not to present a side. The reason they're being brought in is to present an unbiased, neutral observation of India. And unfortunately, all of these international rankings that I've been studying that are there to provide a neutral academic account, all of them line up with what these commentators and journalists are saying. So from the standpoint of an editor, it looks like they are presenting a neutral, unbiased view. After all, Sweden's Variety of Democracy Institute agrees. America's Freedom House agrees. Britain's Economist magazine agrees. The Cato Institute agrees. That Shekhar Gupta pointed out. Even the Cato Fraser Institute.
Cato and Heritage also?
Well, Cato agrees because the Cato Fraser Institute Human Individual Liberty Index is all based on VDEM data, which is something Shekhar didn't realize. So
they were libertarian.
Well, it's libertarian, but they're just using VDEM data. So so when all of these supposedly neutral academic or quasi-academic sources align with what the journalists are saying, Sananand Dume in the Wall Street Journal, okay, I think he has a strong position on Indian politics. You probably think he has a strong position on Indian politics. But from the Wall Street Journal's standpoint, all he's doing is saying, look, those neutral observers at VDEM said this. We should take it seriously. Well, that doesn't sound biased to an editor at the Wall Street Journal. It sounds, if anything, centrist.
I mean, the reason is that these outlets are expected to have high qualities of fact checking, and yet they do not do the same vetting when they choose the people that they do, right? I mean, there's some gap, I think, on both sides. I think that is where I slightly differ from you, because I think that we expect higher standards from New York Times when vetting people.
Yeah, forget about
New York Times.
Forget about your standards. So fact checking. I just taught fact checking in class yesterday at the University of Sydney. Fact checking has itself become politicized, as I'm sure everyone is aware. So even having fact checking doesn't ensure that you're having balance. No, the entire world of journalism has moved away from present all sides of a story in a balanced way, which was the old ideal of journalism, to what I like to call mission journalism. The idea that journalism should be getting at some kind of universal truth. The journalist should take a position, right? And that lack of that reduction or that disregard for the professionalization of journalism. I mean, from the 1920s up until the 1990s, journalism became increasingly professionalized. You should leave your views out of it. You're just there, to be a conduit for what's really occurring. But the popularity of, the All the President's Men becoming a movie, journalists being inspired to go into journalism by Bob Woodward, being their inspiration. He brought down a president. That's what I want to do as a journalist, is bring down a president. That trend has now become, whereas Bob Woodward was a minority crusading journalist reined in continually by his editors 40 years ago. I mean, watch the movie. It's a fantastic movie. Bob Woodward is played by Robert Redford, and Dustin Hoffman plays Carl Bernstein. And watch my favorite actor in that movie, Jason Robards. Jason Robards plays Ben Bradley, who's the editor of the Washington Post, who's constantly telling Bob Woodward, not good enough. Get people on the record. You can't make these claims unless you can back them up. I'm not going to publish this. At one point, there's a clip you can get on YouTube where he says, put it on page 10. And Carl Bernstein, played by Dustin Hoffman, says, but, and Jason Robards gives him one look, and he shrinks back because Ben Bradley, he may have had political views, but as an editor at the Washington Post, back in those days, in the 1970s, his position was, we have to get the facts right. It doesn't matter whether the facts are something you like or don't like. We're here to get the facts right. Now, today, it's not the Ben Bradley. They're gone. That generation's gone. It's the Bob Woodwards of the world and the people who admire the Bob Woodwards who are at the apex of journalism. And their goal is not, I want to get the facts right. Their goal is, I want to have an impact. I want to make my name. Yeah, I mean, if you think about The Economist magazine, they have corporate authorship because the whole point was journalists aren't supposed to be making their name. We shouldn't even know who the journalist is. That shouldn't be important. Well, that's now ridiculously old-fashioned as a goal. Journalists want to be part of the debate, and so the New York Times, they're in the debate. They're no longer just record. They're no longer the paper of record. They're simply a participant in these political debates, just like you are or anyone else is.
Right. So you've spoken a lot about these rankings, right? I wanted your take on, do you think India or some institution in India, maybe an independent body, should also publish some international rankings of its own to contest
No.
these rankings do you think it's...
Lots of people brought that up. I think that would be silly. First, it is not worth the financial effort to rank 200 countries just so you can get a better ranking for India. Okay. Second,
not necessarily, but a different point of view.
So like doing a global ranking just because you don't like India's position is, I think, a ridiculous overreaction. Second, what kind of methodology would you choose? I mean, if you say, well, for all the other countries, we'll choose the same methodology, ask the leading experts in those countries. Yeah, but for India, we'll choose different experts. Well, then no one will take your ranking seriously anyway. I think there's much more traction to be gotten with carefully examining the rankings. I mean, I have a new report out March 1st on the VDEM rankings that carefully unpacks the 5 sub-indices that underlie its electoral democracy index, that shows why these are false. It shows how it is that Hong Kong, under Chinese rule, can tie India for the first 2 sub-indices, which are universal suffrage and elected officials, can beat India on free and fair elections, and can only fall behind India on freedom of expression and freedom of organization. Or how Vietnam, again, a communist country, can tie India on those 3 main rankings. So the question is, how does this happen? It happens because of the construction of the methodology. So what I've done is done a really forensic analysis of the methodology and the problems behind it. And I think getting greater publicity about those sorts of problems. What are the serious methodological flaws that lead to this, that lead to a conclusion that really just can't be taken seriously? The idea that Hong Kong has much freer and fairer elections than India can't be taken seriously. So how did they arrive at that? And that, I think, getting wider publicity for the dispassionate scientific criticisms, I think, would go a much longer way. Now we're trying to do that. I mean, we've started a think tank here called Indian Century Roundtable. We're trying to get some traction around our unpacking of the rankings and the problems behind them. We'll see how that goes. But I think that would be much more productive internationally than simple petulance, or we'll run our own that everyone would then ignore.
Right. You've spoken a lot about the EIU and the Vaden, rankings, but I want to talk a little bit on the Pew Research survey because they did their International Religious Freedom Report, right, where they rank India below illustrious countries like
Oh,
Afghanistan,
no.
Congo, Myanmar.
Forget belows. The worst country in the world. Below everybody. Literally, India was named the worst country in the world for social hostility to religion, meaning the ability to practice your religion free from coercion or violence in your country. Worst in the world.
My only problem here is forget about the authenticity of this study. Pew's own previous report on religious practice and religion, in India, which had a very robust sample size, sampling across the country, itself,
29,999 cases. Yeah.
yeah, and that itself was completely contrary to the findings here. So how is it that the same research center can have data that one data in that country doesn't talk to another?
So this
I mean,
opens a window into the mechanisms by which India has been vilified. And I wrote about this in my article in the March issue of Quadrant magazine. It's the top of the cover of the magazine, and it's about, I called it Unholy Alliance. So if anyone just searches Unholy Alliance, they can get a PDF of the report. Unholy Alliance and my name will pull up the report. So this really is a window into things. So the Pew has been publishing an International Religious Freedom Index since 2009, I believe was their first one, or published in 2010 with 2009 data. India has always been ranked in the worst 10 in the world for social hostility to religion. Even before the current BJP government took office, it was ranked third worst, fourth worst. Now it's absolute worst, but it's always been targeted by this report. Now, that targeting, this report was funded by the John Templeton Foundation, which is a foundation that's mostly affiliated with Christian missionary causes, though they also fund broadly questions around science and religion or the role of religion in society. They're not in any way specifically anti-Indian or anti-Hindu, but they're certainly pro-Christian as a point of view. Okay. So the Sir John Templeton Foundation funds this religious freedom program at Pew. This program then duly finds that they created a metric for studying social hostility of religion that strongly prioritized barriers to missionary activity, and in particular barriers to international missionary activity. Okay. So on their metrics, blocking any kind of resistance faced by international missionaries, even if it's not government, even if it's just somebody yelled at a missionary, well, that's a black mark, right? So under their methodology, and there are lots of technical problems with methodology. Let's leave the technical problems aside. It's designed to say we want to break into India because missionaries are we're going to malign India because missionaries don't get what they want there. Okay, the report produced by this Pew, though, which is actually being written by a person of Bengali origin. I don't know whether she's Bangladeshi or Indian Bengali, but it's a Bengali name, a Majumdar. This report then focuses on anti-Muslim repression, supposed repression in India. Right away, you have a problem. You have this metric funded by a Christian missionary organization that finds that all of its data that's used, all the metrics, check the boxes that say India is doing badly, are overwhelmingly about treatment of Christian missionaries. But the report that comes out says, aha, look at this, India's anti-Muslim. because the report says India's anti-minority religion. And when I say minority religion in India, what do you think of? You think of Islam. Okay, so this report comes out. Now, I think they faced pushback. I don't know. I have no inside sources. But I suspect there was some pushback within Pew because Pew is a highly reputed social survey center. They are the best survey research center in the world, unequivocally, hands down. And so I think there might have been some embarrassment. Why are we producing this low-quality report? Couldn't we get some real data? I don't know if that's what happened. I suspect it is. Because the Sir John Templeton Foundation then gave them $2 million to produce a first-class study, survey researched, nearly 30,000 households, conducted, I think it was, in 17 different languages, all across India, 86% response rate. I mean, this is an incredible survey of freedom of religion in India. And I suspect that they assumed they would find serious problems. That is, I strongly suspect this survey was funded with the intention of providing the hard data to back up all these allegations. However, the survey did not actually find any problems. In fact, it found 98% of Christians and 98% of Muslims say they're free to practice their religion. I think it was more than 90% of both groups, don't quote me on this, it's in my paper, said that they were very free to practice their religion. But only 2% said they had any lack of freedom to practice their religion. Now, 2% is tiny. I mean, if you get 100 people and you ask them, are you unhappy about something? Someone's going to be unhappy, even if they're, so it's minuscule. 99% of Indian Muslims and 99% of Indian Christians say they're proud to be Indian. Okay, there's just not a problem. So what did the report say? The report put a headline: Indians largely free to practice their religion, but prefer residential segregation, but live in segregated communities. So the only thing they could find to criticize was that in India, Muslims tend to live with Muslims, Christians tend to live with Christians. Hindus tend to live separate from those two. Now, we could view that as a problem or not. And for an American audience, that sounds like a problem. Like, residential segregation reminds us of the United States, where African Americans were prohibited from living in white neighborhoods. Now, in India, that's not the case. I mean, there is residential segregation in India, but it's largely, not entirely, there's some historical issues behind this, I recognize that, but it's largely self-selection, right? People prefer to live in segregated. Whether that's good or bad, leave aside. It's certainly not a lack of freedom to buy into a neighborhood like it would be in the US. Okay, so they have this report that they're almost embarrassed by. Right? The hard data say that everything's really fine for Muslims and Christians in India. So what do they do with it? They report it. You can get the data. It's online. And they ignore it. So that the next International Religious Freedom Report to come out doesn't mention it. I mean, it's incredible. They spent $2 million on this top quality survey, and their own International Religious Freedom Report comes out the next year, and they don't mention their own survey because I'm pretty sure the survey was an embarrassment for them. It didn't show what the funder wanted to show. What can you do? But none of this has anything to do with Muslims. I mean, the Muslims are being weaponized, right? The funder is a Christian-oriented foundation. Pew is a liberal internationalist organization. I mean, where is the focus on Indian Muslims coming from? It's coming from the opportunity to vilify India in a narrative, because you can cherry pick a few negative things and make a negative case.
Yeah, that's true. You also mentioned often that sometimes Indians tend to, put themselves at the center of every issue. And case in point being the BBC documentary, where you felt that it was much ado about nothing. So, and it was more at Rishi Sunak. So,
I'm convinced it was all about Rishi. And I got some inside information that further convinces me.
Okay.
Yeah, I have a friend who had a friend of a friend who knew someone who was interviewed and featured in the documentary. And apparently the person was interviewed only 2 weeks after Sunak had become prime minister. And so my friend said, see, this is evidence. They must have been designing this months in advance. And I said, no. they got the leak. They immediately said, who can we get on tape? And, so like the timing was just absolutely perfect. 2 weeks after Sunak became prime minister, a day or two later, someone released, or maybe a day or two earlier when it was clear Sunak was competitive, released from the Foreign Office, someone leaked the report. And within 2 weeks, the BBC was doing interviews trying to get this. It only takes a few months to put together a documentary like this. This is not a documentary 5 years in the making. This is, we got a leak, we're going to use it. So yeah, I'm pretty sure it was all about Sunak, not about Modi.
So uh, I want to ask you, because the diaspora of any nation plays a very important role, a significant role, if not a substantial one, in terms of the relationship, because there's some kind of roots there, so there are ties, right? Do you think the Indian diaspora can play a role? Because to a large extent, some of them are the ones who are going into these outlets, but the larger diaspora obviously is not anti-Indian as well, just like how people in the West are not. What role do you think they can play? Because when you compare Indian diaspora versus the Israeli or the Armenian or even the Kurdish, they don't even have a country, but look at the role they play, right? Do you think it's unorganized? Do you think what do you think can go better there?
Look, the Indian diaspora is playing a role in shaping Western perceptions of India. Unfortunately, it's playing a negative role. Now, of course, there are multiple Indian diasporas. Right, so there is what I like to call the comprador class. They're people who, if you think back to the independence movement, people like Nehru and Gandhi, even Savarkar, who were British barristers who spoke and wrote in English, who had strong connections to England. Jinnah, for that matter, was a British barrister. And they were people who were at the interface between British rule and the governance of India. India needed Gandhi to keep India governable. It needed Jinnah to keep India's Muslims governable. Okay, and they're called the comprador class because it arises out of the Portuguese term of the compradores, that is the buyers. Comprador is just Portuguese for buyer. The people who initially European colonists relied on to go into the local population and buy the things they wanted to bring back to Portugal or later to England. This comprador class has long dominated our understanding of India. And I put it to someone recently this way. If you think you go to a cocktail party in the Hamptons where the New York Times editors are, what kind of Indian are they likely to run into? They're likely to run into a member of the Gandhi family. I mean, Rahul Gandhi is much more likely to be at a cocktail party in the Hamptons than an RSS senior RSS leader, right? Mohan
The
Bhagwat.
idea itself
I mean,
is
okay, I want to imagine Mohan Bhagwat is there in the Hamptons at a cocktail party. It's unimaginable. But if I told you Rahul Gandhi was at a cocktail party in the Hamptons, yeah, might have been. Oh, okay. So it's this sort of person who's likely to be asked, "Oh, what do you think about India? What's going on in your country?" Right? You're a member of our class. Tell us what's going on. Would you write a column for us about that? Right. So it's this class in the diaspora, the comprador elite, who've so far created the agenda on India. Now there's a new class of Indians in the diaspora, this new, very muscular, rising India, new India class of primarily engineers and doctors. But after this first wave of engineers and doctors, of course, many of them are retiring and becoming active. So you see people like Rajiv Malhotra in New Jersey, retired tech entrepreneur. Now he's active in what we might, for better word, call, lack of a better word, call the social sciences. We have the Hindu American Foundation, which is not founded by members of the diaspora, but by their children who've become lawyers, right? So their parents may have been doctors or tech work. Well, now their children have grown up as lawyers in America, and they're ready to sue everybody, who does something, anti-Hindu. Okay, fantastic. Coalition of Hindus in North America. Again, we have these new diaspora organizations that are so sociologically very different from this comprador elite. And they're now starting to change that narrative, or at least push back on that narrative about India that's been established by the comprador elite. So, things will change. There is a role for the diaspora in producing a more balanced view of India. I won't say a correct view of India. I don't take positions on that. I'd like to see a more balanced view of India in the West. And while I would like to see a more correct, factual account of India, I don't think that's coming from either group. For a factual account of India, I really think you have to go to the data, to the dispassionate, quantitative analysis of data from India instead of either group. I personally, I feel more at home with the New India diaspora. I'm more likely to be invited to their party than be invited to the cocktail party in the Hamptons, because I myself am, a child of immigrant families who, comes up as a new middle class. Like my story as a Greek Italian American replicates the story of these new diaspora children much more than it does the old crust elite. But I recognize that that's a bias I have. I try not to be influenced by it. I always try to go to the data.
Right. India, in a way, is a very natural democracy, right? Although we do take for granted, because in the first generation of freedom fighters definitely had a lot of role to play in keeping those institutions in full force. But the geopolitical relations between India and the West, and also this whole the intelligentsia and all of these things, interactions that happen, shouldn't there be more synergy just because the two sides are democratic? Why doesn't that lead to better understanding of each other? Like maybe let's say Japan.
Look,
I don't know.
that's the rhetoric. That we're a common community of democracies, and of course that's why all of these accusations that India is no longer a democracy, that it's now an autocracy. In VDEM's latest report, India and China were held up in parallel as the world's two great autocracies, as if they were somehow equal. Read the VDEM report. So that's why these accounts are so damaging, because they do undermine this narrative of a community of democracies. That said, Indian democracy is, I think, founded on a very different basis from Anglo-American and, by extension, Western democracy. And this is what my book's about. I'm working on a book. Tentative title is Dharma Democracy. But the basic idea of the book is that Indian democracy does not arise out of individualism and the rise of individualism the way that Anglo-American democracy does. It has a very different basis. It's much more communitarian. It much more arises out of a sense of duty to society than out of a sense of individual rights.
Right.
And thus India, that's when Indira Gandhi put the charter of responsibilities of the citizen, into the constitution, it wasn't pulled out afterwards, right? I mean, those who opposed Indira didn't necessarily oppose the idea that there should be a charter of duties in the constitution. India is the only major democracy, as far as I know, that has a charter of duties in its constitution. There may be others. I'm not saying that categorically. Email me if there are. I'd love to see them. So this idea that India has a different basis for its democracy, I think, is one of the reasons why it has not been such a natural fit with the Anglo-American democracies. Now, I don't know if that's the whole reason. Of course, India is also much poorer, so there are differences there. India has historically been politically non-aligned, whereas all of the other major democracies have been aligned towards the United States. So there are other historical reasons that might account for it. But I do wonder how much it may be true that Indian democracy is, in a way, very foreign to American democracy, because it is founded on a different sociological basis. The political science of India may resemble the political science of America, but the political sociology of India is very different.
Okay. Do you think there are any countries where this understanding, like there's a greater understanding of India, like outside of the West or maybe in the Western world itself? I mean, some people say Israel is, but again, even if you read the Haaretz, you'll know that it's really no different in comparison to any of.
Yeah, in Israel, it's a common enemy sort of approach that both are opposed to international Islamist terrorism, and so the two come together. No, I think India is actually quite unique as a post-colonial democracy. And if you want to look for people who might understand it better, maybe you have to go to Nepal or Bangladesh or Sri Lanka. There's countries where people have a real familiarity with Indian society. Now, I say that I have not actually read scholars and scholarship coming out of those countries. I've only had conversations with PhD students and master's students from those countries, but they seem to have a more intuitive understanding of Indian democracy than people from Western countries do. I think for people from most Western countries simply have a few broad misunderstandings of India, just their basic misunderstandings that are all they need to know about India. Everything you need to know about India in 2 or 3 sentences is really what I see coming out of Western analysts. And sometimes that's a very pro forma positive. Oh, India's a democracy, we should support it. But really with very little deeper understanding behind that of what drives Indian democracy. I just don't see a lot of understanding um, anywhere in the world. India is in many ways sui generis.
I mean, no matter what you say, there's always been a very strong Indophile elite as well in the West. At all points of time, even if you go back to Henry David Thoreau and all the way, right, you know, you go even the Beatles. I mean, they were like a cultural influence, and look at the influences they had, right, from Hinduism and India. So, and Steve Jobs came to India for his life changing experience and all that. So, where do these people go? I mean, forget about Indians writing. I mean, are there, are those voices also not given any?
First of all, let's be serious. It's a very small number of people. Um, Second, where it has gone mainstream, it's been stripped of its Indianness. So the global influence of yoga, for example, most people who practice yoga couldn't even tell you what country it came from.
Yeah, that's true.
There's no sense in which yoga. I mean, I know there are efforts to reclaim yoga for India, but good luck. Um, the It's a very narrow group, and a lot of it has to do with ancient India, not with modern India as it exists today. So there's a romanticization of Sanskrit among some of those older intellectuals. The Thoreaus and so. If you want to go back to the 19th century and the Theosophist movement, I mean, the Theosophist movement still exists, but it's a very small movement. The Theosophical Society. No disrespect. They're serious people, but it's a very small number of people, and they're not in love with contemporary Indian society. They're romanticizing their own version of an ancient India that may not even have existed. So no, I don't think there are really very many prominent people in the West who. Well, I take that back. In all my conversations I've had in Australia and also in India with Westerns in India, the people who are really well informed on India are business people. Western business people have much more knowledge of Indian politics,
Wow.
Indian society. I mean, top business people who are driving investment decisions. So if here in Australia, I want to talk to someone who has real knowledge of India, I can go to Commonwealth Bank or ANZ, uh, and because they're running back office operations in India, they're steering investors towards India. Macquarie Bank has fantastic depth of knowledge about India. That's really, I mean, these people aren't writing about it. They're not intellectuals as
Right.
such. But yeah, they know what's going on, and they know what's happening they know what's happening in Indian politics. They certainly don't buy the propaganda that Narendra Modi is somehow an evil fascist. They scoff at that. Most of the business people I've met just say that's completely ridiculous. They're aware that India has governance challenges, but they mostly think that if there's a problem for them in India, it's that India is genuinely democratic. And I've had business people frankly tell me, well, when I go to China, they'll just flatten 10 villages to make to set up a factory for me. In India, I have to deal with civil society. I have to deal with the courts. So they're very aware that India is a functioning democracy with a functioning civil society. They may like that, they may dislike it, but they're aware of it in a way that the activists and the intellectuals and the academics simply seem to have no clue.
This is a very unique point that you mentioned. I think free trade agreements and greater business engagements and industry engagements itself can go a long way, I think, in terms of interactions. Now, I want to come to a topic which you haven't spoken much about, which is basically your expertise in comparative sociology. And you come from an angle of quantitative methods, right? Rather than qualitative. So, for students who want to pursue this as their career, right? Advice would you have in the sense that should there be, what kind of balance or what emphasis should be there on quantitative and statistical methods in social sciences? Uh,
So first, go do your PhD in the U.S. or Germany. They're, they're just the training just isn't there in the UK, Australia. You can't get the training. Second, unfortunately, I've had people ask me, "Can you just give me a book or something?" And unfortunately, you really need to do 3-4 years of statistical training to get to the ground level where you can then start handling the problems. The challenges of quantitative analysis of country level data are really poorly understood, and they're extremely difficult. So we have two basic problems. One is called spatial autocorrelation. Spatial autocorrelation is just what it sounds like. It means over space, there's a correlation from space to space to space. So in Europe, for example, the axis from Milan to London has been the rich part of Europe since the late Middle Ages. And if you move away from that axis, either towards the west, you get to Western France is the poor part of France. Spain is poor. Or if you go to the east, well, East Germany is poorer than West Germany. Poland is poorer. Russia is poor. So this regularity is such a firm spatial regularity, but we don't have tools to account for it. So if I do a survey, I ask, like Pew, 29,999 people, a set of questions. If I choose 29,000 Indians at random, somebody might just happen to know one other person in the sample, but fundamentally each of you is giving an independent answer. But when I look at data for countries, the countries are incredibly interdependent. There's strong correlation. If Germany goes into recession, Poland is going into recession, right? I mean, there's just, so I have this serious problem, statistical problem, that I don't have independent cases. And all of our classical statistical methods, everything you're going to learn in the first 3 or 4 years of statistics, assume independent cases. So spatial autocorrelation just kills everything, and it makes it extremely difficult to do quantitative studies, which is why in my own work, I've pulled away from doing over time longitudinal analyses, and I've pulled away from doing what we call regression modeling, so modeling using countries as cases to establish statistical regularities. And instead, I've started focusing on measurement issues, which is what brought me to the rankings. I've been publishing not just on the democracy rankings, but also on the university rankings. That is, rankings are something I'm interested in because they don't involve these problems of autocorrelation. We're just trying to measure something about a country. Whether it affects something in another country, I don't care. I just want to know what is the actual measurement for my country. So I've gotten away from the usual modeling we do of economic growth rates and, future of democracy, these sort of models. They're just statistically incredibly complicated, and focus on the simpler issue, which is still very complicated, of how do we properly measure things like globalization, university performance, democracy. Even that's hard enough, and I focused on that as my own area. But yeah, if you want to be a student in this, you have to get a base level statistical training first. Then you can read my book, Methods for Quantitative Macro Comparative Research, which assumes you already know
the basics,
classical statistics through some sophisticated regression modeling, and then you can start pushing the field forward. It's a very challenging field.
The National Education Policy, the NEP, has actually laid a lot of emphasis on interdisciplinary studies, where, a student of science will learn social sciences. And there are two schools of thought in this, that when you have people from the pure sciences entering social sciences, they'll bring a certain scientific rigor in the study of the social sciences. And the other point of view is that the social science people will get their heads inside this space as well, and they will basically proselytize the pure sciences. So what do you see as a possible outcome of this interdisciplinary approach?
Yeah, to use a Christian metaphor, the cross I bear is that I've been reading and writing about interdisciplinarity for 30 years now. It's always been fashionable. Every decade I could point to advocates of interdisciplinarity, and yet it never really happens. It never really comes into effect. And the reason is that we have a peer review in academia, and disciplines protect their own. So I wouldn't worry so much about social science infecting the sciences, or vice versa, because you just get driven out. You can't publish stuff. It just doesn't matter. Instead, what I encourage is true transdisciplinarity, where you have your disciplinary training. I'm a quantitative comparative sociologist. And then I go out into the world of Foreign Affairs magazine, Foreign Policy magazine, the newspapers. And I argue my case based on my training alongside an international relations scholar, or maybe a practical diplomat, or a business person who also publishes in these same journals, right? So we have to have a conversation with each other on neutral territory. And I think that's much more productive. Trying to get the individual person to be trained in multiple disciplines, it's just not practical. It just doesn't work as a model. But insisting that people from different disciplines have to come interact out in the public world, yeah, that's where we get more productive things. And if I can use it, forgive me, I'm going to mention COVID. So the key failure of COVID policy around the world, everyone now recognizes, is that it was driven so entirely by one disciplinary perspective, that of virologists. Not even public health. It was specifically virologists who drove the agenda on COVID. So, in the United States, famously, I can't believe I just blanked. Anthony Fauci, virologist who drove the agenda. To the extent that the Centers for Disease Control, epidemiologists, they were sidelined. Never mind economists, education experts. So all these people from different disciplines who had a lot to contribute, their viewpoints were ignored, minimized. Their contributions were simply disregarded. And I think most people now accept that our COVID responses all around the world would have been better if we all had to sit down and the politician listen to the virologist and to the public health expert and to the education consultant and to the economist and to the sociologist talking about marital breakdown, and to the and to the psychiatrist talking about problems of loneliness and suicide, right? And if the politician had listened to all of these disciplinary voices and taken them all into account in formulating policy, most sensible people, I think, now agree that that would have given us better policies. And in the same way, on all topics we're interested in, the issue is not that, you, Vineet, should have 5 different disciplines embodied in you. It's that you come from your discipline, I'll come from my discipline. We meet on neutral territory and we hash it out. And society, through its formal processes of policymaking involving elected officials, society will ultimately come to a compromise that takes all of our input and arrives at its own solution.
Yeah, I think it's a wonderful idea, brainstorming and exchanging ideas, and I think building on it. I think it's a very good approach. I want to ask you with regards to, you mentioned that qualitative sociology obviously is more open to being subjective, and quantitative sociology by its very nature has to be objective, but a lot of interpretation that is going into quantitative as well is now becoming subjective. I mean, what?
Yeah. There's scope. I think qualitative social science has greater scope for subjectivity. And among most qualitative sociologists, subjectivity is embraced. But it doesn't have to be. I mean, you could do qualitative social science with a strong commitment to objectivity, to keeping yourself out of the research, and the research is something purely objective. It's just that philosophically, the people who tend to do qualitative research tend to philosophically embrace subjectivity. The people who do quantitative research philosophically embrace objectivity, even when they're not being objective. And so that results in what's often being called in research the charisma of numbers, or the charisma of statistics. The idea that it looks like we're being objective. Well, as the old phrase has it, there are lies, damned lies, and statistics being the worst lies of all, because we can cherry pick statistics. We can subjectively make of them what we want. And so subjectivity is always there, even in quantitative social science. So it's there in different ways, but you're right. I mean, a lot of quantitative social science is still quite subjective. It's embodied in the way we measure things. I mean, just look at the VDEM rankings. The way they've chosen to measure things embodies a lot of subjective judgments about what should be. Look at the International Religious Freedom Reports. I mean, even if I had the pure quantitative study of religion, I could say allowing missionary activity is the most important thing for freedom of religion. Or I could say respecting other people's religions and not attempting to convert them is a respectful approach to religion. Now, which one is the most respectful approach? Well, that's subjective, right? So even if I have a number that I can attach to it, my subjectivity decides what I want to study in the first place.
Exactly. It's the lens you have,
And
right?
that's just
Because
inevitable.
for someone practicing their religion safely without discrimination could be more important than actually getting the right to spread it. So, how do you actually?
Oh, we might even argue that spreading it is inherently disrespectful, because by spreading religion, you're in effect saying my religion is superior to yours,
Yeah.
and thus I should have the opportunity to convert. I mean, we can make an argument either. No, I'm not opposed to proselytization. I simply acknowledge that we could make a perfectly reasonable, liberal argument as to why proselytization should be prohibited. And it would still be a liberal argument about freedom of
The
religion.
individual
And it's,
seeks the philosophy rather than the philosophy seeking the individual.
yeah, yeah, we could. Well, uh, I could argue that it is inherently disrespectful to believe that my religion is so superior to yours that I should have the absolute right to attempt to convert you. Now, I'm not saying I feel that way. I'm saying we could build a liberal argument around this, that people who are proselytizing are being disrespectful of religion by the fact that they are proselytizing. Now, I take no position on this. I merely point out that we have alternate approaches to religion that could, even though they're diametrically opposed, could both be viewed as liberal approaches versus, say, repressing religion. That's definitely illiberal. You know, uh, uh, identifying a religion as evil and suppressing its practice. All right, we all agree that's illiberal. But what constitutes liberal is really up for grabs. And it was up for grabs in the Indian Constituent Assembly debates. There was a real debate over proselytization. And you notice the word in the Indian Constitution is right to propagate religion. There was a lot of debate about that because the original draft coming from Ambedkar only, I think, said practice religion. It didn't say propagate. And some people argued, no, we have to include, to be inclusive to Christians, we have to include propagation. And some people wanted to include proselytization. But the word they settled on was propagate. When one Hindu member of the Constituent Assembly, I forget his name, I apologize, raised exception and said, no, this will lead to all sorts of proselytization. The person who was making the suggestion said, no, it won't. Propagation doesn't imply proselytization. And there's debate about this. Now, propagation in its most natural English language meaning means that I can teach my children my own religion. That is, I can propagate it to the next generation. And so the right to propagate in its most neutral, like I'm not trying to now, it can also mean
Yeah.
proselytize. But if you meant proselytize,
Totally.
why not say proselytize? Right? So the fact that the word chosen specifically was propagate implied, and it was used to imply in the Constituent Assembly debates that, well, we'll allow you to continue your religion. It's not just that you have freedom of religion, but let's say in school. So the reason propagate was so important. What if you had everyone attend a state school, and in the state school, it taught children that they must worship Hindu deities? Yeah, you have freedom of religion. You can do what you want. But in the state school, your children are taught Hinduism. Well, that would violate the right to propagate your own religion. And so, for instance, in Australia, all students in Australia do a religious studies course as part of their part of their high school education. But if you're Catholic, you can do a Catholic religious studies course. If you're Protestant, you can do if you're Jewish, you can do a Jewish one. If you're Muslim, you can do a Muslim one. If you're atheist, you can do a theist one. I mean, you don't have to do. Okay, so each group has the right to propagate its own religion. In the most natural understanding of the term, I would have read if I were reading the Indian Constitution in 1949 from a neutral American perspective, I would have understood propagate to mean that you can have your own religious schools, you can have Sunday school or whatever the Hindu equivalent of Sunday school instruction is. You can in your family teach your children your religion, but I would not assume a right to proselytize others from that statement. Now, it's been construed as that right. That's one. You could construe it that way, but that was a decision that Indian jurists made 70 years ago. Right? Both are liberal. Both approaches would be liberal approaches to freedom of religion. And this is sort of the same kind of perspective I've been offering throughout. If you read carefully everything I've been writing about India, I'm not advocating one or another position. I'm merely contextualizing things to say that, well, no, we can't call this anti-democratic when it's within the practice, comparatively speaking, of what countries do that are democracies. I mean, leave religion aside. What if India, what if the current issue of Supreme Court nominations, what if the Indian government passed a constitutional amendment saying that the government could appoint new members to the to the Supreme Court and could appoint, one every time someone died, and it could do so on a political basis? Well, the Indian Supreme Court would strike that down as interfering with the basic structure. There would be cries of interference with the independence of the judiciary. You'd be downgraded on VDEM, right? But of course, what I'm describing is the U.S. system for appointing Supreme Court justices. Is that not democratic? I mean, if the U.S. system is not democratic, there's no democracy in the world.
Well, on that note, we come to the end of our conversation, Salvatore. It was great to have you on the show once again. And I think we should do it as a regular practice, especially to round up when you've made your trip to India. And you look completely in place in those Indian costumes that you're wearing, especially on the head. And all you have to...
It's not a costume, it's just a hat. And I like the hat. I have a fez, by the way. If you'd rather see me in the fez, I'll put on the Ottoman
all
fez.
You have to do this, and there'll be people voting for you soon. So, anyways, so thank you all. Thanks a lot for joining us.
My pleasure. My pleasure. I really appreciate the invitation. It's great to talk to you.
With that, we come to the end of our show, guys. Please don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe to the channel. See you along. Until next time.